Step scaling is useful when you want the scaling settings to vary based on the size of the alarm violation. So, here we have the auto-scaling group that we configured earlier. As you can see, we have one instance running with a desired capacity of 1, minimum of 1, and maximum of 3. On the Automatic Scaling tab, I removed the policies we configured earlier. So, to add a step scaling policy, I will click on Create a Dynamic Scaling Policy. Select from the Step Scaling list. I will give it a name such as Step Scale Out. Then, we will select the alarm that we configured earlier called CPU 80%. Next, we have the option to configure the action. We can add new instances, delete instances, or set the number of instances to a specific count. Since this is a scale-out policy, I will select to add more instances, and let's add 1 unit of capacity or 1 EC2 instance when the CPU utilization is between 80 and 90%. But right now, the upper limit is not configurable. It becomes configurable when you add another step, and when you set the upper limit, you'll notice that it automatically becomes the lower limit for the next step. So, I'm going to set the upper limit as 90%, and it automatically becomes the lower limit for the next step. So, to summarize, let's add 1 EC2 instance when the CPU utilization is between 80 and 90%, and we are going to add 2 EC2 instances when the CPU utilization exceeds 90%. So, the scaling setting will vary depending on the size of the alarm violation as such. In instance 1 up, I'll set it to 1 so that we see the changes quickly, and I'll click Create. And now, we have a scaling policy that uses the size or magnitude of the alarm to determine how many instances to add. Let's add one more policy for scaling. I give it a name like Step Scaling. I will select the alarm named CPU 40%. We'll configure the action to delete 1 EC2 instance when the CPU utilization is between 40 and 30%, and to make the lower limit configurable, we'll add another step. We set this to 30%, and that becomes the upper limit for the next step. So, we are deleting 1 instance when the CPU utilization is between 40 and 30%, and we will delete 2 instances when the CPU utilization is below 30%. And we will never go down to 0 instances because we have the minimum capacity set as 1. I will click Create. And now, we have 2 scaling policies, 1 for scaling and 1 for scale out. So, let's try this out, and before we do that, we'll first hit the update button up here. Note that the current desired capacity is 1. Only 1 instance serves my website. Then, we select the Step Scale Out policy, Actions, and Execute policy. To execute this, we will need to specify the value of the alarm metric. I'm going to specify this as 95 because our Scale Out policy is triggered above 80%. I'll click on Execute. I'm going to click Refresh, and notice that we now have 2 additional instances. This means that this policy has been executed in order to match the desired capacity. If I go to the Activity tab, we can see that 2 new instances have been launched. Now, let's run the scale in policy. In this case, I will set a value of 15%. Remember that we have set a policy to remove 2 EC2 instances when the CPU utilization is between 40 and 30%. And that's what we should see when I click Execute. If I refresh up here, we can see that the policy has been applied correctly. So, as you can see, step scaling is a powerful method by which you can configure your scaling policies to react differently depending on the magnitude or violation of the alarm. And remember, when you're done testing this lab, be sure to remove your auto-scaling group, the elastic load balancer, and any other resources that might cause you some cost.